Hi guys, Totallydubbed here, and today I'm doing a video review on the AOC C27G2ZU. Now this is among one of the cheapest 240Hz monitors available on the market. It can be found for around £300 in the UK. The slightly larger variant, the 31.5 inch version, can be found for around £330. And if you don't want an adjustable stand, built-in speakers or a USB hub, the C27G2ZE is found for around £280, so that's even cheaper. So that's pretty insane for a 240Hz monitor. Now for that price, it's worth bearing in mind this is a 27 inch or 31.5 inch monitor that has a curved design, runs full HD at 240Hz with a VA panel with a quoted response time of 0.5 milliseconds via MPRT. In terms of display outputs, you've got HDMI and DisplayPort to choose from, so that's pretty much all you'd really need. Now I'd also like to point out that if you're interested in buying the monitor, do check out the locally link in the description below. That'll take you to your localized Amazon store. However, it is worth pointing out that at the time of posting, this is pretty much a world's first video review or a review of any sort of this monitor. As such, there might be limited availability, but I'm sure AOC will update its stock throughout the world in due course. So with the introduction out the way, let's get into this review. So we start off with the build quality and design. Now the monitor has a three-sided borderless design. As I mentioned before, it's also got a curved display. Now, the monitor on review, the ZU model, has an adjustable stand. As such, you've got height adjustment, tilt, and you can also swivel it around. You won't be able to rotate it around, it's worth bearing that in mind. In terms of the stand itself, it's pretty sturdy, provides good sort of stability. And in terms of the look of it, I've got no issues whatsoever, but it's got a black and red design, so it's just worth bearing that in mind as well. As for the ZU model, you've also got the USB hub, so that's 4 USB 3.2 Gen 1 ports to use as well, and you've got two 2-watt speakers, which quite frankly will be useful for Windows notifications, but if you're going to be gaming or indeed listening to a lot of music, then I'd suggest getting speakers or using a DAC and headphones. Now next up we move on to image quality. Now this monitor has a 27 inch VA based panel. Now among all the monitors I've tested, which is over 140 monitors, I have noticed that VA panels generally have a more washed out tone. And it's very much the same case with this AOC monitor. Even though with the calibrator, which is the Datacolor Spider X Elite, what I did find is that the monitor does hit the sRGB standard very well in the sRGB mode when selected via the OSD. Now it's worth bearing in mind that when I did select this, I did find its contrast ratio wasn't as good as when it was in user mode. In this case, the contrast ratio was around 1600 to 1, which is still very good, but when you went to user mode, it went up to near 1900 to 1. Now what does this mean? Well, ultimately, if you're going to be using the monitor like I did, what I would suggest is putting it on user mode. You will want to adjust the color accuracy to make it a little bit more color accurate, at least to your eyes. However, if you are going to be using this for any sort of video editing or color editing or anything like that in the sRGB space, you will want to use it in sRGB mode. As such, the color accuracy in sRGB mode is actually pretty stunning for, again, for a 240Hz monitor. You're looking at an average delta E of 1.39 and a maximum of 2.77. To be quite honest, that's pretty insane and pretty much one of the most color accurate 240Hz monitors I've found out there. Now moving on to user mode, this does drop, at least to my eyes and my settings that I had, via the calibrator to an average delta E of 2.83 with a maximum of 5.1. So it's worth bearing that in mind in terms of if you value the actual overall color accuracy or you value the actual image quality in terms of how it looks like to your eyes. It is also worth bearing in mind that when you do run it on sRGB mode, your overall brightness reduces to around 225 nits, whilst the maximum brightness of this monitor is around 300 nits. Now it's worth bearing in mind as well that if you do enable MBR, which basically reduces the motion blur, that this will drop significantly to 35 nits, which is ridiculously low. Now this might not be a problem for someone who plays in a really dark room. However, it's worth bearing in mind that that setting will reduce the overall brightness, and yes, your brightness will be locked, so you cannot adjust it over that 35 nits that it has. Now this leads me perfectly onto the gaming section of this review. Now the monitor out the box with 240Hz 240Hz does pass frame skipping test. You'll be able to see this image over here via Blurbuster's UFO frame skipping test. So there's no issues running at 240Hz, and as I mentioned before, it is a full HD panel. Now, before I get into competitive gaming, it's worth bearing in mind that this monitor does support NVIDIA G-Sync via a DisplayPort cable, at least from my graphics card, which is the RTX 2080 Super. It hasn't got a G-Sync module built in, so do not get confused with that. However, in my case, with my card and via DisplayPort, I was able to run G-Sync with no issues whatsoever. Now, those with AMD graphics card will be pleased to know that this monitor has a frequency range of 48 to 240Hz, so it's a pretty wide range, but it's worth bearing in mind if you do drop below that, you might encounter a bit of stuttering. Now, in terms of competitive gaming, I launched up some Counter-Strike, and in terms of my first tests, I was actually very impressed as how the monitor responded, both in terms of its response time and also in terms of its input lag. So first off, in terms of response time, I dialed up the overdrive to its maximum setting, and here the monitor really didn't have that much issue in terms of inverse ghosting, which is normally plagued by a lot of VA-based monitors. Now again, I'm using Counter-Strike as my benchmark. If you start playing, let's say, more graphically intense games like Destiny 2 or potentially even like Valorant, then you might notice a little bit of ghosting, which you might want to dial down that setting back to around medium. But at least on the strong overdrive setting, I was very impressed over here. And I must say, in comparison to a lot of other monitors I've tested, this one really had a very minimal inverse ghosting. Now, with those response time tests out the way, I then moved on to my input lag test, and here again, with the low input lag mode enabled through the OSD, which is enabled by default, the monitor responded very well, at least to my clicks and points. I was very impressed. I will say it is probably one of the most responsive monitors I've come across, as in responsive both in terms of its response time and also in terms of its input lag. I was seriously impressed on the whole in terms of its gaming credentials. So then I put it to the test and actually played some deathmatch with Counter-Strike, as I normally do when it comes to testing monitors. And here I found myself, my performance wasn't as good, and it was a little bit weird because it felt like it was somewhat linked towards the motion blur. There seemed to be a little bit of lack of cohesion between when I was shifting between scenes. As such, when I enabled the MBR motion blur, this became much better and therefore allowed me to connect my shots better. However, due to the fact it being running at 35 nits and in a pretty bright sunlit room, it meant that seeing the actual monitor with my own eyes was pretty much neon impossible. So I was struggling to see enemies even though the motion blur was somewhat reduced. So what I'm trying to say over here is that even though the monitor responds really well and does really well in tests, in actual practice, I found myself not really connecting my shots as much as I should do. So ultimately, what I'm trying to say over here is in terms of its gaming credentials, the monitor does well, don't get me wrong. It's got all the right specs, and in terms of color accuracy, it actually does pretty well. But in terms of your real world experience with your own eyes and your own response in terms of how the monitor responds, what you'll find is that the monitor doesn't quite do as well as more premium grade 240Hz monitors. At least, as I said, this is from my experience and from my sort of feedback that I will give you quite honestly and unbiasedly and unpaid, to say that this monitor just doesn't tick the same boxes as more expensive 240Hz monitors. At which point I can see why you'll be spending a lot less buying this monitor, because you'll be compromising in terms of its overall gaming performance. Again, I can't stress it enough, it was interesting to see how amazingly this monitor responds and how fantastic its input lag is, and also the fact that it's got the good color accuracy out the box and checks all the calibrator reports. But when it comes to real world experience, this is where machines or calibrators and stuff like that really can't give you the same sort of experience, which I can't stress it enough. There's a degree of objectivity and of course a degree of subjectivity. I try and blend the two so that it gives you a good idea of my own experiences and what you might experience yourself. So that's what I'm trying to say. It is one of the cheapest 240Hz monitors available. Should you buy it? Well, that's completely up to you. I'll let you be the judge as to what you deem as it being good or not. not. But personally, if I was looking for a 240Hz monitor, I would spend more money and get a more premium grade 240Hz monitor. There are some out there, but yes, they're going to cost about 100 to potentially 150 pounds more. And I know that is a lot of money in comparison to what this actual monitor costs. But if you're really serious about competitive gaming, like I am, then you'll probably want something that really does tick every single box in every sort of respect. As such, do check out in the links in the description below for some of my alternative suggestions for you guys. So there we go, guys. I've been Totally Dubbed. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video. Make sure you give it a like, subscribe, and share, and all that good stuff, as it'll always help the channel grow. Take care, guys. Totally Dubbed out. Bye-bye.